Hello my loves and welcome back to another episode of Fluffenhammer Adjacent. We're supposed to be doing a sort of Fluffenhammery thing yesterday with my colleague Adam, but I have a little bit of a cold and yesterday I didn't have any voice at all, like at all. It would not have been much of a podcast, to be perfectly honest, but got my voice back today, just feeling a little bit fluey, not COVID-y, fluey, you know. Nurgle hasn't touched me to that degree yet, fortunately. Touch wood, you know. I imagine it's some level of either Zechian or Slaneshi protection, since I tend to vacillate between those two of the Chaos powers of late. But yeah, I actually managed recently, I was just digging around in the various nooks and crannies of my little maisonette, and I found an old white dwarf, like from the early days of 3rd ed, 40k, and in it were articles about the then newly released Khorn Berserker box set, the plastic Khorn Berserkers, which were at that time a new and revolutionary kit. There was literally nothing like them out there, really. They were one of the most advanced, one of the most mutable kits on the market. Fantastic piece of work, so good in fact that owing to the confounding and puzzling lack of other Chaos Space Marine kits, which could have very easily been designed off the back of these, quite frankly, they became more or less the default Chaos Space Marine plastics for years. People just bought those kits, regardless of what Chaos God or Legion or whatever their armies were centered around, and just adapted them. They cut off all the Khornate iconography, which is not difficult to do. You can do it with a modeling knife very, very easily, and turn them into generic Chaos Space Marines. They turned them into Noise Marines. They turned them into Thousand Suns. They were very, very mutable, very easy to convert, very easy to model, change around, shift around. An excellent kit at the time. Of course, fast forward some 20 years and we're still using the same Khorn Berserker kit. There hasn't been another Khorn Berserker kit since that time. And with the developments in things like the shifts in scale, for example, they look very, very strange. They look very, very, very peculiar at the moment, weighed against things like the current Chaos Space Marine kit, for example, or the Thousand Sun Rubrique, or the Death Guard Plague Marines. They look very plain, they look very cartoonish, and they're just not right. You know, they don't look in keeping with the current range of miniatures, which is a real shame. It's a real shame. Khorn Berserkers are as iconic of Warhammer 40,000, arguably, as your generic Space Marines. You know, people recognize the Khorn Berserkers. Those bunny ears are very, 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 very distinctive indeed. It particularly they look pretty damn terrible when you compare them to equivalents in the Khorn Bloodbound, in the Blades of Khorn from Age of Sigmar. There are direct equivalents in that army that even just look like fantasy versions of Khorn Berserkers. I'm thinking in particular of the Blood Warriors, which are just Khorn Berserkers. What most Khorn players, what most World Eater and Demonkin players do these days, they buy the Blood Warriors and they stick backpacks on them and chain axes and put pistols in their hands because it's really easy to do, and they look for all the world like proper honest to god Khorn Berserkers, how they're meant to look, how they look in the artwork, how they're described in the background, and they are far more in keeping with that sort of more ornate Baroque detail that you find on a lot of Chaos Space Marine miniatures these days. At the time, way back in the early days of 3rd ed, the Chaos Space Marine miniatures were actually kind of pared down by contrast. They were not that chaotic, funnily enough. They had the characteristic banding and ribbing and exposed chest wires of Chaos Space Marines, but they didn't have the more sort of warp-tainted, mutated elements that a lot of the present-day miniatures have. And that makes them stand out as well. They're a little too clean these days. They just don't really work with the current miniatures range. And it's a great shame. Khorne Berserkers do really deserve a little bit more. They are very iconic of Warhammer 40,000. They're a lot of people's favourite Warhammer 40,000 unit, and their background is superb. I mean, they are really interesting because they're so clear that in terms of what they do and how they're supposed to function. They are just frothing psychopaths. You just chuck them at the enemy and they hack and slash and murder and maim until there's nothing left, until there's just chunky kibbles left strewn in their wake. That is what they are. Of course, way back when the World Eaters were first described back in the Realms of Chaos days, in the early days of Rogue Trader, there were no Khorne Berserkers. The Khorne Berserkers are a new development, relatively speaking. What there were there were not the sort of lobotomized, butcher's nails implanted Khorne Berserkers. There were Chaos Squat Berserkers back then, and there were Khornate Assault Marines. And it was those Assault Marines that later sort of morphed and transformed into the Khorne Berserkers in the very latter days of Realms of Chaos. They were actually released. The Khorne Berserkers were released almost synonymously with the Noise Marines. The Noise Marines for Slaanesh were also not in the original Emperor's Children list. What would eventually come to be defined as the cult units didn't exist back then. Your Thousand Sons Rubricae did not exist. Your Khorne Berserkers did not exist. Your Noise Marines did not exist. Now, your Plague Marines did. Interestingly, your Plague Marines did. They were the only cult unit that did exist. But all they were the Nurgle-marked Chaos Space Marines. That's all they really were. They had 1 point more of toughness, and they had a few more die 3 random Chaos rewards, I do believe. And that was about it. That's what really defined the Plague Marines. But the Khorne Berserkers and the Noise Marines were released as a White Dwarf edition. And then you had a limited range of miniatures released, all metal, by the way, at that time, all metal, to go alongside them. It wasn't really until 2nd edition that they really started to get fleshed out, where you had this notion of the Khorne Berserkers not just being Space Marines that had dedicated themselves to Khorne and therefore had just lost their minds through the corruptions of chaos. Rather, you had this whole notion of Angron, their Primarch, being a gladiator on some long-lost, forgotten planet that had no name back then. It wasn't until very recently that the name of that planet was revealed in the Horus Heresy series. In Betrayer by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, that was where it was first named as Nuceria. Up until that point, it wasn't even referenced. It was just a planet that Angron fell on and was lobotomized to become a gladiator in their gladiatorial arenas. That's where the original Khorne Berserkers derived from. Angron brought that practice back to the World Eaters, and so new recruits were lobotomized, the butcher's nails were implanted, and they became these frothing maniacs, whereby the butcher's nails are a fantastic concept, by the way. They are a fantastically grotesque, inhumane, horrible, such a repulsive concept. It can only exist in something as parodically and ironically grimdark as the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They are an example of technology that only exists because of the excesses of the rich and the abuses of the underclasses, right? They were used on Nuceria because Nuceria was a planet dominated by a particular class of aristocracy, of born privilege, and they maintained a sort of peace amongst the underclasses by funneling them into these gladiatorial arenas. It's basically bread and circuses, right? It's that whole philosophy. And they did that by taking certain examples of them and lobotomizing them and surgically implanting these archaic machines into their brains that slowly drove them mad and linked their pleasure centers to the act of violence, to anger, to hatred, to bloodshed, and made every moment where they were not engaging in those activities ones of excruciating agony. And that's what Angron has implanted in his brain, and that's what the World Eaters have implanted in their brains too. Every moment where they are not engaging in violence, they are experiencing excruciating agony. Whereas when they are committing violence, they're experiencing a kind of ecstasy that would shame a Slaanesh worshipper. And it's become an artifact of sanctity for them. they don't believe themselves to be mutilated. They believe themselves to be blessed. They believe that it's a sacred rite that transforms them into the Crusaders, the Templars of Khorne, right? They believe that the butcher's nails are a blessing of Khorne. They are not a curse. They are not an imposition. And they believe that it was actually providence that Angron fell on Nuceria. It's a fascinating thing. There's a wonderful, compared to some of the other cult legions and their concomitant cult units, there's a wonderful purity to the Khorne Berserkers. There really is. And at the same time, a kind of complexity. It's really, really fascinating. As time goes on, they lose any semblance of who they are. They lose any notion of self or restraint or even of self-preservation. There are stories of the Khorne Berserkers when they cannot find anyone to slaughter. They turn on themselves. They actually drive their own chainswords into their entrails or cut off their own heads in sort of ecstatic worship of Khorne. It's really so gruesomely over the top, so ridiculously violent. It's the kind of horror that can only exist in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it's really, really cool. But of course, because there haven't been any new miniatures for the Khorne Berserkers for a very long time, they've kind of been left on the wayside. They were pretty good in 8th Ed, and they're still pretty good now. I mean, they have the ability to fight twice, which is quite rare in 9th Ed, and is very, very, very good indeed. They can fight twice per assault phase, which is quite powerful. And there's also stratagems that allow them to fight again. So there is potential for them to fight 3 times in the assault phase, which is amazing. Absolutely amazing. It makes them really what they should have been for the longest time. But there has been a tendency for the Khorne Berserkers to be left at the wayside, to be honest, in comparison to other assault units from other armies. Like if you compared and contrasted them to, for example, Drukhari Incubi, through the ages, the Incubi were just better than them. They were just a million times better. Space Marine assault units generally have just been better than the Khorne Berserkers. It's sad, but it's true. Units like the Death Company from the Blood Angels, who are they're sort of like the Imperial analogue to them in many respects. They have a similar problem, they have a similar dynamic going on. They just happen to be Imperial instead of Chaos. I've always just been better. They've just been better than the Khorne Berserkers. However, it looks like that might be changing. I mean, as we've discussed on recent episodes of the Fluffenhammer, we know that there's a potential World Eaters Codex on the way. We know that in the up-and-coming Chaos Space Marine Codex, which is about to hit quite soon by all accounts, the World Eaters and the Khorne Berserkers aren't in it. They're not in it because there is a World Eaters Codex on the way, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It means that arguably for the first time, or maybe for the first time since the Khorne Demonkin book, which was released in 7th Ed, we're going to get a really sharp, close focus on what the World Eaters are and what the Khorne Berserkers are, how they operate, what their culture is, how they function psychologically, and I'm all for that. I mean, if the quality of the World Eaters Codex is anywhere near that of the Thousand Sons and Death Guard, then it's going to be brilliant. It's going to be an amazing piece of work. I know that there's quite a lot of whinging out there on the forums with regards to the Death Guard and Thousand Sons, and I just don't see it, I'll be honest. As a Thousand Sons player, I just don't see it. I've had several games with the Thousand Sons in 9th, and I think they're great. I think they're an absolutely wonderful army. Bearing in mind, I don't play competitively. I really don't. I play narratively more than anything. I like the narrative of the game, but I've enjoyed playing with my Thousand Sons. I do believe that for the first time ever, they play as they should. They are this sorcerous occult whirlwind of an army that emphasizes very particular strengths and very particular weaknesses, as they should do. And I love that. I absolutely love that. The World Eaters, in many respects, should be the diametric opposite of the Thousand Sons in terms of the way they operate. The Thousand Sons emphasize firepower and psychic chicanery, trickery, subtlety. The World Eaters are the exact polar opposite. They emphasize the assault phase primarily. That's where all their strength lies. That's where all the cards are. They have no psychic chicanery at all. because of course Khorne hates psykers and sorcerers, regards them as cowardly. And also the World Eaters themselves really despise sorcery, psykers, and all that kind of thing. So absolutely nothing in that regard, but should be almost unstoppable in assault. That's the way they should be. They should be an absolute hammer of an army. In the assault phase, there should be nothing that can stand up against them, really, or very little that can stand up against them. But they should lose out in some of the other phases. That's kind of the gamble you play with the cult legions. They are very defined. They're very specific, and I kind of love them for that. They are, in terms of the way, in the respect that there are tiers of army in Warhammer 40,000. They are very much, it's almost like choosing to play on a slightly harder mode. They are tricky to use. The Thousand Sons are really tricky to use. You've got to really think about how you're deploying your army, how you're structuring your army, who has what psychic power, what naughty little tricks you're going to play with your relics and your psychic powers during the game, etc., etc. That's the way you play them. That's the way they work. The World Eaters have to be similar, albeit in a very different way. You are really going to have to think about how you use them, because all of the emphasis is going to be in the assault phase. And I'm going to assume that there are going to be special rules and whatnot that accommodate that. Their biggest issue is going to be transport. They are going to have to close the gap very, very, very quickly to be effective. And that's difficult in 9th Ed. Assault-based armies tend to suffer quite a lot in 9th Ed because it's all about the big guns, right? It's all about the big guns, and it's all about the long-range combat and the trickery that you can perform. So the World Eaters are going to be a tricky one. They're going to be a difficult one for them to get right. But it's going to be wonderful having a Khorne Codex again. Like I said, we haven't really had one since the Demonkin. I don't even play Khorne. Khorne is my least favourite of the Chaos Powers, but he is a Chaos Power, so I like him. I like all the Chaos Powers. He's my least favourite. He's the one I don't play. But I like the fact that the World Eaters will be getting what we've got now, what the Thousand Sons and the Death Guard have got, and what I assume eventually the Emperor's children must be getting. There must be a Slaanesh Codex, at least in conception, out there somewhere. I mean, my God, after the World Eaters, they're going to have to do it, aren't they? They are going to have to do an Emperor's Children Codex, because that will create the quorum. That will be all of them, right? That will be all of the cult legions manifested as they should be. I cannot wait to see what they do with it, particularly Angron. Angron, again, is a tricky Primarch to render, because unlike the other Demon Primarchs, he doesn't have the psychic powers. He doesn't have any psychic powers at all, because he doesn't. Khorne doesn't gift psychic powers. Instead, he has unnatural powers of ferocity. He is basically a living storm. He's like a living earthquake. He should be a little bit like Kragnos in Age of Sigmar, He should be causing, wherever he steps, he should be causing environmental damage and terrain damage, because he is just fury and violence made manifest. He should basically be insanity on the tabletop. And the only way you should bring him down is with massed firepower. There shouldn't really be much in the game that can stand up to him in close quarters. Very, very little indeed. Can't wait to see what they do with him and what the model looks like. I mean, the artwork and descriptions of Angron are fantastic. He is almost like the most classic looking demon Primarch of them all. He looks like a big red demon, basically. And in the artwork, he's got a twisted version of his armour that he wore when he was a mortal Primarch. And also, the Butcher's nails are extending from his scalp as a kind of mane of wires and tubes that burrow into his back and lash around him. So, yes, this could be something very special when it hits. There will be new Khorne Berserkers, obviously, because that will be with one of the core kits for the army. For the first time in 20 years, we'll be getting new Khorne Berserkers. Can't wait to see what they do with them. Really cannot wait to see what they do with them and how they update them, make them bigger, make them interesting, make them more elaborate. Yeah, it's going to be a fine old time for Khornate players, I have no doubt. I have absolutely no doubt. And of course, when it hits, there will be an Ages of Chaos deep dive, of course. So until then, my loves, bye-bye.